hosted by the Centre for Scottish and Celtic Studies. I'm Jerry Carruthers from the Centre for Robert Burns Studies, and it's a great pleasure to welcome my colleague Kirsteen McCue, who's Professor of Scottish Literature and Song Culture at Glasgow. I won't say an awful lot by way of introduction because Kirsteen will make a lot of this stuff plain to you in terms of her presentation. Kirsteen's a considerable expert in the history of Scottish song, having worked on the likes of James Hogg, very noticeably, and of course, Robert Burns. And tonight she's going to be speaking about Robert Burns and his song editor, George Thomson. Kirsteen has just edited, and it's just been published, very wonderful volume 4 of the Oxford edition of the works of Burns. Her volume and George Thomson, in a sense, is why we're doing this event tonight. And if I may do another plug very briefly, Kirsteen also has a piece in another book that will be out at the end of this month from Edinburgh University Press called Performing Robert Burns. But the main point tonight is her wonderful new edition of Songs for George Thomson, which she's about to tell you about now. Kirsteen.
Thank you very much, Jerry, and thanks especially to Katrina MacDonald and the Centre for Scottish and Celtic Studies. I hope that everybody can hear me clearly. Give me a few thumbs up. That would be great to know that that's fine. And I'm about to thank you. It's lovely to see so many of you here. Thank you for your time this evening. As the blurb for this presentation mentions, and you're now clear from Jerry's introduction, really this is just an excuse to punt a new book at you, I suppose. It's to tell you a little bit about this new edition that we've been working on, and I'm going to share some slides. I've got some pictures to show you to take us through the talk. So if you'll bear with me for 2 seconds, I'm going to just share my screen, and I'm going to share that too. And that should be us. I hope everybody can see that. Is that okay? Can everyone see the slides? Yeah, great. So, yeah, my talk this evening is really related to the imminent appearance on the 18th of February of the new 4th volume of our Glasgow edition, Oxford edition of the works of Burns. And it marks really the end of the first major grant from the Arts and Humanities Research Council for a project called Editing Robert Burns for the 21st Century, which Jerry was alluding to in his introduction, but of which he is the principal investigator. This funding allowed us to undertake major research and to develop a whole load of complementary resources related to Robert Burns's prose and songs, and a new team is now well underway with work on a second project focusing on Burns's correspondence and poetry. So I'm tempted to say I may be the fat lady, but it's not over yet. As I've said on many occasions since the start of the project, and I should say it's only one of the things that makes this edition different, one of the things that makes it different is the way we've edited or approached the editing of Burns's songs. Many of you here tonight will know Burns's songs as poetic texts, and indeed they are. They will appear also as part of Burns's poetry in the final volumes of our edition edited by Jerry. But no edition of Burns's work prior to this one has chosen to examine and present Burns's songs with music as they appeared in Burns's own day and in the decades immediately following his short life, so after his death in 1796. Most of us know that Burns is inspired in song from his early years by the singing of his mother and local family and friends, by the singing of a young lass that he's partnered with in the harvest in his 16th year, which brings about his first song. Most of us know that he loved a good singer, that he was inspired by tunes, and that he spent much of his creative time in the last years of his life working almost exclusively on songs. Some of us know from anecdotal accounts that he had a good go at learning how to play the fiddle, the stock and horn. He seems to have had a guitar and possibly even a wooden flute. But if we believe anecdotes, we know that he had no singing voice and that you couldn't dance to his fiddle playing. Two editions of Burns's songs, those by James C. Dick in the early years of the 20th century, and our predecessor as the Oxford editor, James Kinsley, whose edition came out in the 1960s, finally included melodies to identify the songs as songs over and above their lives as poems. But unbelievable as it may sound, over 200 years after all of this, no formal edition of Burns's works has stopped to fully consider the fact that the majority of Burns's songs were written or collected for two major contemporary collections of published songs with music, until now. So let me just take you through the first volumes of our edition to make a wee bit more sense of this. The edition began back in 2014 with Burns's prose works, edited by Nigel Leask, and you can see the day the book came out in the photograph on this slide. It includes Burns's tour journals, his commonplace books, so his personal journals, and several other works that have to date received little editorial attention, including his Glen Riddle manuscripts, the special volume of works and comment that he gave to his friend Robert Riddle, and even the Manual of Religious Belief that Burns's father created for the Burns children, amongst the miscellaneous prose that's included. Then, in 2017, came the first bit of the song puzzle, and you can see here Murray Pittock with volumes 2 and 3 of the edition. And these include the first iterations of the famous song collection, the Scots Musical Museum, published in Edinburgh by James Johnson between 1787, that's just after Burns had first met him in Edinburgh, and 1803. 6 volumes, each containing 100 songs and a collection which Burns engaged with head on. Volume 5 was just about to come out when Burns died in 1796, so all bar the final volume really appeared during Burns's lifetime. And Murray's new edition is the first since their original appearance to present the very first printings of this collection for the Catch Club, and it's the first modern edition to recognise that there are significant changes between these and the set of volumes that were reissued when the 6th volume appeared in 1803. We've only got a small number of letters between Burns and Johnson, but we do have a wealth of manuscripts, not musical manuscripts, but manuscripts connected with the Burns songs in the museum. And by focusing exclusively on this edition and Burns's role within it, rather than just looking at these songs appearing amongst Burns's poetry from this period, we've really been able to see how Burns began to deliver songs for a large project. He wrote some, he also collected and edited some. And Murray categorises Burns's involvement with each of the songs in this collection in a category, a sort of categorization that ranges from 1, a song wholly by Burns with no antecedents identified or suspected, to number 8, a song in which Burns had no hand. So there are 8 categories showing the diversity and the range of Burns's involvement with the songs in this edition. Now we are introducing and presenting volume 4 of the edition of Burns's songs for George Thomson. And this is me on Saturday in my mum's front room because the box arrived on Saturday. So I have actually, beside me, got the copy in my hand, even though it's not officially out till next week. One might be forgiven for thinking that one song collection is very much like another, especially ones that were created in the same city, in Edinburgh, or began to be published in the same decades. It's in the 1780s and 90s. And indeed, there are some strong similarities between these two collections. Here you can see the title pages of actually Robert Riddle's copy of the Scots Musical Museum, or volume 3 of the Scots Musical Museum. And you can also see the title page on the right-hand side of the screen, which is Thomson's title page with a rather more opulent title, A Select Collection of Original Scottish Airs. Both collections include musical notation with lyrical texts. Both are made by gentlemen, with the inclusion of song texts by fellow gentlemen and some women, poets, antiquarians and musicians, and both are keen to collect and protect a national canon of songs. After Alan Ramsay's pivotal publications of Scots songs in the early decades of the 18th century, in the 1800s and 1810s and 20s, and we're going to see more of them very soon through our new Alan Ramsay edition, Johnson, Thomson and others at the other end of the 18th century are still working on the concept of building a national song legacy for Scotland. And indeed, Burns pointed this out to both of his song editors. He played Johnson off Thomson and vice versa rather beautifully while he was working on his collection, on Thomson's collection. When Thomson invited Burns to contribute to his big collection in September 1792, he explained that he was creating his collection for the honour of Caledonia, a name of which Burns was very supportive. In April 1793, Burns wrote to Thomson, and you can see at the top of this slide, "Your book will be the standard of Scots songs for the future." But just weeks before his death, maybe on balance, he voiced the same view to Johnson about the Scots Musical Museum. "Yet I will venture to prophesy that to future ages, your publication will be the textbook and standard of Scottish song and music." As I suggest in the edition, over 200 years on, it's the museum which really has delivered in this regard. Thomson's collection and his collaboration with Burns remains an awkward bit of the Burns story. And what I want to do in the presentation this evening is ask why this is and look briefly at how our new edition might help us reassess this amazing artistic collaboration. So here is George Thomson. Born in Fife in 1757, came to Edinburgh in the early 1770s to work as a clerk in a writer to the Signet's office. He got involved with concert life in the city as a keen amateur singer and player and fiddler, involved on and off with the Edinburgh Musical Society. And by the 1780s, he gets a job and is quickly promoted to the role of senior clerk to the Board of Trustees for the Arts and Manufactures in Scotland, a post-1707 union institution which deals mostly with the export of Scottish produce, herring, wool, flax, hemp and linen mainly. And it's important to make this clear because many critics give erroneous information about Thomson. He was there for a part-time song editor and his big song project, taking up almost all of his very long life, he doesn't die until 1851 at the ripe old age of 94, was his hobby as opposed to his salaried job. Thomson's collection was from the start quite a different kind of commission than that of the museum for Burns. Burns was already enjoying his work for Johnson. He had made his tours, which were very much inspired by his interest in collecting songs and visiting places associated with songs and tunes that he knew or wanted to learn about. And he responded to Thomson's invitation enthusiastically. He was able to work further on the song culture that he loved. He was able also, arguably, to expand his reader base because Thomson's collection, although created in Edinburgh by Thomson, was published in London by one of the major music publishing houses of the moment, Preston's in Dean Street. Burns's poems, chiefly in the Scottish dialect, had appeared in London in 1787, published in association with Cadell and Davies. That's just a year after it first appeared in Kilmarnock. Francis Grose's Antiquities of Scotland, which includes, of course, as many of you will know, Tam O'Shanter as a footnote, and I kid you not, appeared in London in 1791. And Burns's friend, the Earl of Buchan, had published his essays on the lives and writings of Fletcher of Saltoun and the poet Thomson, that's namely the Scots London poet James Thomson, in 1792, and that featured Burns's address to the shade of Thomson, to James Thomson. So this new commission from George Thomson, who published his first set of songs in London in 1793, was arguably building nicely on southern audiences for Burns. And Burns's initial excitement and the red-hot speed at which, at times of heightened creativity, he produced songs for Thomson is notable, not just at the beginning of this project, but actually running until just days before Burns dies. The idea of manufacturing songs is discussed specifically in Burns's letter of September 1794, which makes direct reference to Thomson's use of his day job to support his song publications, because he also used banking and diplomatic channels through the Board of Trustees to aid his song work. Little do the trustees for our manufactures when they frank my letters to you, says Burns, little do they consider what kind of manufacture they are encouraging. We'll see in a minute the process of making songs was not always natural or organic in Thomson's collections. And so the idea of manufacturing a product for export is telling. Bearing in mind that these two men were busy professionals by day, Burns was appointed as an exciseman to the Dumfries Port Division about 7 months before he received his first letter from Thomson. Both of these men showed remarkable energy and commitment to the process of making and publishing songs. One need only look at the letters to Thomson across the next 2 months after he's written that quotation in October and November 1794 as examples of the intensity of the exchange between these men. Burns, in response to Thomson, lists, discusses, and encloses numerous songs in just one letter. Such enthusiasm and productivity is not often remembered in later Burns criticism. Thomson's collections, which were published between 1793 and the 1840s, received a mixed reception, even during his own lifetime. Thomson enters the Burns story in 1800 with James Currie's first edition of The Life and Work of Burns. And he comes to prominence because the fourth and final volume, which you can see the cover page for here, presented exclusively the correspondence between Burns and Thomson and the songs enclosed within them. Next to Burns's great female friend, Frances Dunlop, the letters to Thomson are by far the biggest single group of letters that we still have in existence. And one of the things I discovered, which I hadn't been aware of before, was the detailed sort of range of jobs that Thomson did for this edition that Currie printed. Currie publicly congratulated. It's quite controversial because Thomson did clearly edit some of these letters, and there's a big furore about this in the early 20th century, which I'm not going to go into here, but I'd be happy to chat to folk about. In short, Currie publicly congratulated Thomson as facilitator of Burns the songwriter. And John Gibson Lockhart, Walter Scott's son-in-law, later in his Life of Burns in 1828, stated that working for Thomson, Burns knew that he was now engaged on a work destined for the ear and eye and ear of refinement, continuing that for Burns, and I've put this on the slide here, the consequences of this collaboration have been happy indeed for his own fame, for the literary taste and the national music of Scotland, and what is of far higher importance, the moral and national feelings of his countrymen. Not long before Lockhart's description or criticism, an unnamed reviewer in the Literary Gazette and Journal of Belles Lettres commented that Thomson's collections included poetry of the highest lyrical class, and also noted that this work is most worthy of the lovers of harmony. We know no musical collection at all equal to it, and are sure it will afford the utmost delight in every family circle where it is received. Lockhart's comments, allied to the characteristics drawn out in this review, are often the characteristics with which Thomson's collections are damned in the Victorian and modern period. Lockhart draws attention to a sense of moral high ground, to feelings that might be heightened by the content of these collections. Burns refers to Thomson's publications as being designed for the sons and daughters of taste. And the Gazette reviewer pauses on the high quality of the poetry and musical content alongside enjoying these songs in the domestic sphere, at home in your own front room. I should just briefly comment here, I'm going to come back to just focus on these a little more, but I should just comment here for those who don't know that Burns wasn't Thomson's only poetic contributor, and across all of his collections, Thomson would publish the work of over 30 contemporary men and women poets with whom he corresponded, notably championing women, it has to be said. Burns died so early in Thomson's project that he had to find other poets, and those included James Hogg, Walter Scott, Lord Byron, and female writers Anne Grant and Amelia Opie, amongst others, to write new songs for him. But next to the English historian and published poet William Smythe, no contributor holds a light to Burns in terms of the numbers of songs and also in terms of the discussion of songs that we find in the collaboration with Burns and Thomson. Now, I'll come on to talk about feelings and the suitability for the drawing room shortly, but one of the things that made Thomson's collections a little bit different from others was the range of musicians that he commissioned to set or arrange the airs or melodies that he sent them. As he outlined in the very first preface in 1793, Thomson had high expectations in this regard. He wanted the finest musical content. He wanted introductory symphonies he wanted symphonies to introduce and conclude each of the airs for his songs, and he wanted these arranged for voice, piano, violin, and cello. While Joseph Haydn was definitely Thomson's self-confessed first Apollo, he was a highly celebrated figure in the 1790s, so Thomson had decided to start with one of his most famous pupils, Ignaz Pleyel, who was in London between December 1791 and May 1792, and was therefore easy to contact. But when he returned to France, Pleyel was repeatedly arrested by the authorities due to his earlier connections with the Viennese aristocracy prior to his move to France in the 1780s. Burns was uneasy about this collaboration from the very start, warning Thomson about the disastrous consequences of allowing Pleyel to alter the melodies before arranging them, and showing particular concern when the progress of the first book of songs was hindered by Pleyel's disappearance in May 1794. This is a picture of Pleyel, you can see here. "I'm quite vexed at Pleyel's being cooped up in France," says Burns, "as it will put an entire stop to our work." And again in July 1794, he says, "Is there no news yet, my dear sir, of Pleyel?" Burns tried in vain to persuade Thomson to engage his local musician friend, Stephen Clark, who had been so central to the music of the Scots Musical Museum. There's a definite lack of confidence in the musical element of the collection from Burns's perspective. And throughout his correspondence, he protests his ignorance of musical matters, claiming that his tastes for the wild and absurd in music don't match the tastes of connoisseurs like Thomson. But in my view, often Burns's protestation of ignorance is simply drawing attention to the fact that Burns's clear and deep knowledge of tunes is evident all over this collaboration. He is quite capable of making his views on this matter very clear to Thomson, but often drawing attention to the higher elements of musical language, which he says he doesn't really understand. As I note in the introduction to the edition, it's really tricky to ascertain Burns's real views about Thomson's musical arrangements, because when he received his first book of songs, the 25 Scottish airs in 1793, Burns exclaimed that he had never before seen such elegance and correctness in a musical publication. That summer, he wrote to his friend John McMurdo, referring to him as a subscriber to that splendid edition of Scots Music in which Pleyel presides over the musical department. He writes positively about Pleyel in his letter to Miss Janet Miller in September 1793, and again to his friend Graham of Fintry the following February, making mention that he will order a copy of Pleyel's piano sonatas on Scots themes for Graham. Having received his own copies, Burns scribbled on the one he gave to Graham's daughter, which is now held at the Robert Burns Birthplace Museum, in which we looked at for the edition. It seems highly likely to me that Burns would have heard the first 7 of his songs as they appeared in Thomson's first publication. And one of these was Pleyel's setting of Burns's Auld Rob Morris. Now, I'm going to try and play this to you. Obviously, what would have been lovely tonight is to have you all in a room and actually to play and hear some of these songs performed, to sit and enjoy them. And sharing it on Zoom is never a good thing, because Zoom just does not do credit to music. But in an attempt to let us hear some of this the amazing product that came out of this collaboration, it seems only right to play one of the songs. And I'm going to play Auld Rob Morris, if this works okay. I want somebody to nod to me to let me know that they can hear this. This is Auld Rob Morris, arranged by Pleyel, published in 1793 by Thomson, and it's performed here by singers Beth Taylor and Jonathan Kennedy, and a musical trio made up of Alina Horvath on fortepiano, Daniel Mintzoli on fiddle, and Nicholas Montgomery on cello. It's on period instruments, and it was recorded as part of our Performing Burns's Songs in Their Own Time project, which I'll tell you about just after we've listened to the song. I'm going to come back to a slide to show you so you can follow the words, okay, and see a little bit of Pleyel's musical setting. But here's the music.
Song.
And my thanks to them. This is time for a wee advert. That project was one of several that we were able to undertake as part of the AHRC fund, or with the help of the AHRC funding that I mentioned right back at the beginning of the paper. And in this case, we worked with 11 young musicians to realise performances of some 25 songs from both the museum and Thomson's collections, working with the original materials that you can see on this slide here. And it was great fun. I learned a huge amount, and it was wonderful to work with these young performers. You can find lots of interesting information about the work that we undertook on all of these projects for the first set of volumes. There are exhibitions, performances, maps, blogs, all manner of goodies on the Editing Robert Burns for the 21st Century website. So please, if you don't already know it, go and have a browse around and enjoy the materials that we've got up there. But let me return to our tale. Burns may have heard that song, but what he didn't know and never heard were the rest of the 174 songs eventually published by Thomson. And they were matched across the next 50 years or so to musical arrangements by Leopold Kozeluch, who you see on the left-hand side, who nobody's ever heard of nowadays, but was quite important in Vienna at the turn of the century. Joseph Haydn next to him, second in, Thomson's First Apollo. Beethoven, very much recognised in the middle there and celebrating his wonderful anniversary, which has been a bit blasted by COVID, but we're hanging on and enjoying as much Beethoven as we can regardless. Carl Maria von Weber next to him, really interesting character in terms of national songs. And Johann Nepomuk Hummel on the far right-hand side, who was one of this batch of practically the only one who did actually come to Scotland. And while discussion about Pleyel in those letters across 1794 that we looked at earlier suggests that Burns was aware of which airs or melodies had gone to Pleyel for arrangement, and was also aware of the other songs Thomson was considering for that publication, he would of course have no say at all over the handling of the vast majority of his lyrics as they were to appear in Thomson's collections. I would just mention here, but only in passing, that the publishing history of the 6 volumes of Thomson's Scottish collection is mind-bogglingly complicated. And so our new edition, with much pulling of hair, is the first to track Burns's texts right the way through Thomson's intricate publishing history or bibliography, picking up and presenting previously untracked songs and including Burns's texts as they appeared also in Thomson's Welsh and Irish collections. But I want to come back to the bones of contention that we talked about a little earlier, and to Lockhart's comments about Thomson's project aiming to publish songs that were suitable for the drawing room. Thomson called himself a songbroker for the ladies, and his clientele is indeed heavily female. He discusses this early on in his project with Burns, and Burns immediately understands the need to avoid bawdier material and to package and choose songs neatly for Thomson in this regard. That said, Thomson makes one notable exception in being the first ever to publish Burns's cantata of Ayrshire Low Life. Is there such a thing, you ask yourselves? Ayrshire Low Life, The Jolly Beggars, with music by London theatre composer Sir Henry Bishop in 1818. Thomson has to sensitively edit, as you can imagine, if you know the work already. And all of this was something that we were able to explore in gory detail in performance as part of our project. We were able to produce the first, or put on the first modern performance of this work and to record it. So have a look at it on the website. Thomson's clientele is also notably British. Thomson's working with a London publisher, and he's creating collections of Scottish, Welsh, and Irish songs. His project then is very much about nation, but it's in a pan-British context. And there's a great deal more to say about this, and that's for another day. But it does bring us to one of the key issues between poet and editor. When songs were written in Scots language, Thomson was keen to include them, but he also wanted to provide English alternatives. And this was a highly controversial editorial policy amongst Burns critics in general, who rightly quote Burns's defiance in his letters to Thomson. There are numerous famous quotes, including the best one, which is Burns saying to Thomson, "These English songs gravel me to death." But the quotation I want to share from you, written in one of Burns's letters to Thomson of September 1792, gives us a wee bit more detail worth pausing on. Burns writes, "If you are for English verses, there is on my part an end of the matter. Whether in the simplicity of the ballad or the pathos of the song, I can only hope to please myself in being allowed at least a sprinkling of our native tongue." But then he goes on to say, "English verses, particularly the works of Scotsmen that have merit, are certainly very eligible. Tweedside, Galashiels, viz. Ah, the poor shepherd's mournful fate, etc. Gilderoy, viz. Ah, Chloris, could I now but sit, except, excuse my vanity, you should for Gilderoy prefer my own song, From thee, Eliza, I must go, etc. All these you cannot mend. But such insipid stuff as to Fanny fair could I impart, etc., usually set to the mill-mill-o, 'tis a disgrace to the collections in which it has already appeared, and would doubly disgrace a collection that will have the very superior merit of yours." We could spend a while looking just at this quotation. The first part, often quoted, is very clear in that Burns is asking and saying that the bottom line for him is at least a sprinkling of Scots. And he writes several letters to Thomson expressing this sentiment in a variety of different ways. But if we read on, we can see that Burns is not against English songs at all, even though there's one in this context that he really despises. And with a title like that, who would disagree? What's clear from working more closely with these songs is that Burns is in fact a real aficionado of English song. He creates many for Thomson, despite these early misgivings, though they're not always his best work, granted. And his expansive knowledge of published collections and popular song prints in broadside and chapbook form means Burns is ideally placed to help Thomson find English songs. There are numerous letters where the two discuss this in detail. Thomson also receives very harsh criticism for meddling and muddling, as one later critic put it. He is vilified in Burns' reception for having made major changes to Burns' texts and having decided on several occasions to change tunes that Burns initially planned for particular songs. As I've just said, Burns wasn't there, of course, to refuse any of these changes after 1796. But what we can see in the 4 years of correspondence between poet and editor is that he does not shy away from frank discussion with Thomson about suggestions with which he does not agree. You've just heard the song Auld Rob Morris, a song that Burns loved for its earthiness. And he was very happy to decline some of the suggestions that Thomson made to refine it. In my Auld Rob Morris, you propose instead of the word describing, which is in the penultimate line, you might have seen it, to substitute the phrase all telling, which would spoil the rusticity, the pastoral of the stanza. And in this new edition, you'll find several other songs where Burns disagrees about Thomson's suggested changes, along with several others where editor and poet work together, sending more than one version of a song backwards and forwards, Burns changing his mind as he goes, Thomson noting these changes, and at the end of the day, adhering to Burns's wishes. And their discussion and collaboration around Burns's The Lee Rig is a really fine example of this early in their collaboration. The example possibly most often used in the vilification of Thomson is his editing of Scots Wha Hae, which some of you have heard me talk about before, or Robert Bruce's address. Woof, that was a faux pas, to his army at Bannockburn. But we need to remember, in the case of this song, that Thomson didn't just make these initial changes without consultation. Burns sent Thomson the text for this song in heightened passion, which you can see from the handwriting on this manuscript on the slide in front of you. And his passion was as much in relation to the current state of affairs in politics and war as it was about Scotland's wars of independence. This is my own photo of Burns's original letter, and I'm sorry it's a bit blurry because you're not allowed to take the original letters out of this very shiny acetate cover that they're kept in. But this is Burns's real letter, as you can see in the bottom left-hand corner of the slide, now held by the Pierpont Morgan Library in New York. It's such a highlight of the project to work with these and actually see them in the flesh. And I have to thank the Arts and Humanities Research Council for funding that. It was really a privilege. While Burns had waxed lyrical about the tune he had in mind for this song, Hey Tootie Tatie, that's the song we all know, Scots Wha Hae, we Wallace bled, Scots won Bruce, that one. Thomson initially proposed to Burns that he use a different air, a Jacobite tune called Louis Gordon. This required him to ask Burns to rearrange some of his lyric, and Burns didn't disagree. Instead, he made the changes to lengthen the lines of the verse to fit the new tune. So the line or to victory became or to glorious victory, or let him follow me became let him bravely follow me. Thomson told Burns that he didn't like the line welcome to your gory bed, and he asked Burns to reconsider changing this to honours bed, but Burns told him that was a hackneyed description, explaining that he was referring to another popular published work on William Wallace, and he refused to make the change. Thomson tried again to get Burns to make the change later on, and Burns said no, even threatening to refuse Thomson the chance to publish the song altogether. So Thomson backed off. He went ahead and published the song with a Louis Gordon tune, but not before Burns had died. It appeared first of all in 1799 with a setting by Courgeluch, but Thomson realised quickly thereafter that he'd made a mistake, and he republished Burns's original text with its original choice of tune, Hey Tootie Tatie, in 1802 with a new musical arrangement by Joseph Haydn. He confessed to his mistake in print, and he might have been best to leave it there, but anxious about the nationalistic fervour of this text at this heated time in European politics, Thomson suggested that if we replace some of the Scots words like wha into who, wham into whom, aften into often, and say into so, we might make the song English. And by substituting Gaelia for Edward and Britain for Scotland, we could adapt it for the present time. Aye, maybe so. This was certainly a howling editorial interjection. There are many other occasions where the two, poet and editor, engage in combat over changes to a text, and Burns speaks his mind and refuses. Sometimes Thomson leaves it, sometimes with no Burns to battle with later on, he makes changes. But the notes to each of the songs in this new edition track all of these changes in gory detail, so that we can clearly see where Thomson is making changes and where Burns agreed to these or disagreed. We can see where Thomson has lifted a text from another source, if it wasn't a song that Burns sent to him directly, so we can begin to see just how far apart Thomson's editing of Burns is from other peers, like James Curry or Robert Hartley Cromek, who both were editing Burns at exactly the same time. We might, from Burns' criticism, think that Thomson stands in a league of his own, but this new collation work that we've undertaken suggests otherwise. Critics have had a tendency to worry also about changing tunes, but as that example shows, Burns was far less pedantic about this than we might first think. As with English songs, Burns was hugely knowledgeable about tunes, and he was able to write text to match tunes easily. He was a highly adaptable and malleable contributor for Thomson. Another nod then to the notion of manufacturing songs. Wrangling over language, suitability, moral superiority, and newfangled European music are all central to the correspondence between Burns and Thomson, though I might argue, and indeed I hope I set out to do that there are two sides to the story, and we need to look at both to balance them with one another. But there's one issue that tops almost all others in terms of Thomson's place in the Burns story. The negativity towards Thomson was notably heightened in the early 1800s when he was very publicly accused of failing to pay Burns for his work, an issue which haunted Thomson until the last year of his life, where he was still writing letters of vindication. And here he is, as an octogenarian in Benjamin Crombie's wonderful Modern Athenians. In fact, Burns was aggressive in his refusal of any payment for work during the early correspondence with Thomson, categorically stating that if Thomson sent him any further cash, because Thomson had already sent him payment, Burns would refrain from contributing to the collections at all. On his deathbed, Burns wrote to Thomson in debt, asking for payment, which Thomson sent, though this wasn't enough as far as some were concerned. Thomson was held up as an example of a socially mobile entrepreneur, only in it for the cash, whose praise of the national bard was but lip service. The introduction to this new edition traces how this all comes about, explores the individuals involved, and again aims to present all sides of the argument so that we can view things anew. It also tracks the considerable involvement of Thomson with the Burns family after Burns's death and in the memorialisation of Burns in the early decades of the 19th century. And another of our online resources shares the images that Thomson commissioned related to Burns's songs from R.T. Stoddart and David Allen, amongst others, which he included across his collections. This beautiful stipple engraving of Burns after the famous Naismith portrait was made for the collections by Thomson's engraver brother Peyton, and it was first published in 1805, and I'm delighted to say that OUP agreed that we could include it at the beginning of the new edition. In sweeping through fictional accounts, critical reviews, Burns biographies, editions, and other criticism from 1796 until the late 20th century, I conclude that the negative views of Burns's involvement in the Thomson project fall into three broad categories. Right up there is Thomson's failure to pay Burns, but Burns's association via his involvement with Thomson with the improvement and burgeoning middle-class clientele for song is very harshly criticised. And there's a real discomfort with Scotland's national music being handled by foreigners who, if we were to believe all the reviews, simply failed to understand this music. Burns, as a cultural icon, was established thanks in no small part to editors like Thomson. We can see here the image that appeared on the title pages of nearly every volume of Thomson's Scottish collection across a period of almost 60 years. And you can see here, it's a quotation actually from Anne Grant, one of the female poets who Thomson really helped launch as a writer. But you can see this little quotation all about the tomb of Burns. And we might muse and wonder whether Thomson's collections have in fact ended up being a tomb for Burns. It's clear that many Burns critics and Burnsians have concluded this was indeed the case. But it's my firm hope that this new edition will open the door and shine a new light on a collaboration that for too long, I think, has been marked out as a negative development in Burns's life. For me, having worked closely with these songs, with the correspondence between poet and editor, with the at times frustrating editorial processes of Thomson, I've concluded that the Burns story would be much poorer without this project. Burns's aspirations for his national song culture, let alone for his own reputation as a creative writer, are clear. But his fervour for the business of songmaking is truly infectious. And without this work for Thomson, Burns may not have been placed in a position of having to articulate his views on individual songs and melodies, or even on his creative process. I've talked this evening about this being a collection of a manufacturing of songs. And I've talked at times of the artificiality of Thomson's editorial process. But in this letter, which I've often quoted from September 1793, Burns pauses for a moment in the middle of writing comments on some 74 songs in one letter to reflect on his own much more organic process of writing a song. Just gonna have a sip of water. Until I am complete master of a tune in my own singing, such as it is, I can never compose for it. My way is, I consider the poetic sentiment correspondent to my idea of the musical expression, then choose my theme, begin one stanza. When it is composed, which is generally the most difficult part of the business, I walk out, sit down now and then, look out for objects in nature around me that are in unison or harmony with the cogitations of my fancy and workings of my bosom, humming every now and then the air with the verses I have framed. When I feel my muse beginning to jade, I retire to the solitary fireside of my study and there commit my effusions to paper, swinging at intervals on the hind legs of my elbow chair, by way of calling forth my own critical strictures as my pen goes on. In my view, if Burns had produced no songs for Thomson, then the relationship between the two is worth it, just for that description. Now, time is moving on, and I have a couple of things I want to say just before I finish. Firstly, it's always exciting to work on a project that runs in parallel with other new ventures. And I wanted to mention two of these which ran in parallel to my work on the edition. Because during the time I was working at the coalface of this, Sue Knight produced her study of Burns's songs and tunes related to them and how these connect to popular 18th century dances. A real labour of love from someone who is passionate about historical dance. And it's a wonderful study that really opens our eyes to another performative dimension of Burns's songs. At the same time, my friends, and this volume is just published by Musica Scotica Trust in Glasgow, my friends Catherine Campbell and Emily Lyle have been working on their volume entitled Robert Burns and the Discovery and Recreation of Scottish Song, pulling together decades of work around Burns's connections with oral sources for his songs. And their set of fascinating essays look at many aspects of Burns's songs as a creator and a collector of song, his connections with Gaelic song, the ways he collected songs with Stephen Clark and Nithsdale being just two of those. These authors all shared the findings of their projects with me as I prepared the work for this edition, and I'm very grateful to them. And I think they run in tandem really nicely with the work that Murray and I have been doing on the big institutional published collections of songs which inspired so much of Burns's song creativity. And finally, because this is in place of an in situ launch of the book, really, I hope you'll just indulge me by saying a few thanks. The acknowledgements in the edition are really long and heartfelt, and I don't have time or space to mention everybody tonight, and I don't want to offend anyone by missing them out. You're all thanked heartily in the edition. But I did want to thank just a few people, principally to my co-editors, to Jerry as general editor, my co-editors on the edition, to Nigel and Murray, and to our new editors, Rona Brown, Ronnie Young and Pauline Mackay, who are working on letters and songs. We work together closely as a team, and I hugely have benefited from their input. Pauline was actually the first research assistant on the project before she became our new lecturer in Robert Burns Studies here. And another RA who worked very briefly with me at the very beginning of Songs for Thomson was Ralph McLean, who's gone on to Pastures New and is now very much involved with looking after manuscripts at the National Library of Scotland. But the two research assistants who worked most closely with me on Songs for Thomson are Doctors Vivian Williams and Jerry McKeever. I'm hoping that both of them are here this evening. Both got a real sense of Thomson's idiosyncrasies at the start and kept me sane as we worked on this, this project. And both did brilliant detective jobs around the music and the texts of Burns's songs. They played major roles in the online resources too. And Dr. Aaron McGregor, great fiddler and aficionado of 18th century Scottish fiddle collections, also gave me tremendous help in sourcing some of the stranger and more unusual Thomson tunes. The new team of our Burns research assistants, Carol Branyuk, Jim Caudle, and particularly Craig Lamont, offered tremendous support in the final stages of the project. And another key person I have to thank is Patrick Scott, our wonderful Burns friend in South Carolina, to whom I have to give a special nod, and he knows how much help he's given me. I also want to thank the team at Oxford University Press, obviously, because it was a big monster to put through production. Copies of specific editions of Thomson are really hard to come by, and we were very lucky to have the generosity of Dr. Bill Zachs in Edinburgh and Professor Marjorie Rycroft, former Professor of Music here at Glasgow, to help in this regard, along with Almut Burma, Music Librarian at the National Library of Scotland, our Special Collections Librarians here at Glasgow University, and the Music Librarians at Cambridge, who all helped pull together the musical settings that you can find in the volume. And Marjorie in particular has been central to this project because she's the musical editor of the folk song settings of Haydn, of Pleyel, and of Weber that are cross-referenced all over this new edition. And I have to say that it was her course on music in Vienna in the 18th century, when I was an undergraduate at Glasgow in the 1980s, that brought me to George Thomson in the first place. So it's all her fault. We have continued to work together, and we've got another resource about to come out on the website to do with Burns and Kozelluch in the coming months. Other colleagues have been hugely supportive. They've listened to me whining on about this project for years, and some of them are here tonight. My lovely friends who have also listened to me whining on about this project for many years are also here. My warm thanks to all of them. And last, but most certainly not least, to my wonderful family who have lived with this project literally day in and day out. So I owe them my greatest thanks. But thank you to you for coming along tonight. I want you to have a look at the website. I hope that you've been inspired a little bit, that you've learned something this evening about this project, and that you are inspired to learn a little bit more now about the artistic collaboration behind Robert Burns' songs for George Thomson. Thanks.